You ever just sitting there in the morning, having your tea, your coffee, and you're thinking, I really don't want to go into work today. You ever wonder what really makes the workplace suck? What are the things that pull away bits of our soul every day? And how can we make those better? One way to look at that is industrial psychology. And today, we get to walk with Professor Hickman and ask big questions about how we can make the workplace better, what makes it suck, what can we do to improve the kindness around us. So with big companies looking at using AI for interviews, how can we avoid sexism and racism? I'm gonna add in the comments something I learned, and I want you, something that you pick up or take away from this, add it in the comments as well, and let's see what we figure out together. All that and more today. So let's go talk. What got you first interested in all the industrial psychology?
Well, again, a very kind of long roundabout story, but to make a long story short, I double majored in creative writing and English, double minored in film and history. This is why after doing computer and information technology master's degree, I needed to get back to problems involving people. That's like stories about people is what I'm studied as an undergrad.
Yeah.
Just kind of found my way over to this interest in studying people at work. Had a kind of serendipitous experience to get exposure to this idea of machine learning in assessment by having class with somebody who was doing consulting for a company, doing these automatically scored interviews. Mm-hmm. And then here I had my research idea and ran with it, and still doing it now 5 or 6 years later. Time's meaningless after the pandemic. I grew up in a very blue-collar family. Mm-hmm. People who come home, hate their jobs, makes you really interested in trying to understand, like, what on earth is going on there that these people come home and every single day they seem unhappy about their jobs that they have to go to.
Right.
And can we study that and find ways? Now, I don't exactly necessarily, at this time, some of my studies ongoing are ways of helping people maybe find work to be a bit more pleasurable, but that's kind of one of the overall goals of IO psychology. Right? In the words of Joe Madden, the former Cubs manager, mm-hmm. Make work, to paraphrase him, make work suck less. It's tough because we're over here on the academic side, and all the economic pressures are what drives so much of what goes on in organizations.
Right.
That limit our impact, but there are so much research from IO psychology does have clear recommendations for making it so people are gonna like work a little bit more, maybe work a little bit harder, and so on. Today we have this interesting tension of people wanting to also go slack off at work, which I get and have done in jobs before I went to grad school.
Yeah.
If there aren't people out there working hard and doing things, which I don't believe is going to happen, we get, artificial intelligence that's general enough to handle all the problems for us. But they've been saying artificial general intelligence is 10 to 15 years away since the 1950s. And so people today are going, ChatGPT, look, it's 10 to 15 years away now. That's what they've been saying for 70 years. We just have to continue to put forth effort. That's what life is. Even if you're not doing anything, you're choosing to do that.
That's a really hard question to answer. How do we make work suck less, especially for sucky jobs, right?
Well, one thing we can do is something we should all do in our daily lives anyway, which social media makes it hard to recognize is so important, that we should treat people with respect and give them the benefit of the doubt. And we shouldn't assume the worst out of people, what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. When something good happens to us, we say, oh, that was my fault, I did that. Even if it was a small $1 million loan from our father to get us started in New York City real estate.
Right.
On the other hand, if something bad happens that somebody else, related to somebody else, we say, well, they did something wrong that led them to be that. It's their fault that they're, in an impoverished situation and so on. And this is true at work as well. Somebody messes up, you assume, oh, well, they were careless. They're, you put pejorative labels on it that are not helpful. Whereas it might be that they, made a mistake. Something happened in their life that is making things really tough for them right now. Trying to have that compassion and empathy, super important, because that's what we would want for ourselves.
Right.
So why don't we give it to other people? People know a lot of, bosses are one of the main things that cause problems at work. people say that you don't necessarily quit your job, you quit your boss.
Right.
Yeah. Problems with how people go about selecting like team leads and managers is they don't select them based on do you have the knowledge and skills to be a good team leader manager? Usually they're promoted to that position because they did well in the job below.
Right.
So the skills and knowledge required for that job are not the same skills and knowledge required to be an effective supervisor or team lead. And so there's help needed to get them to develop and grow, because if what they've seen and experienced is abusive, mean, difficult supervisors, usually that's how they're going to act.
Right.
Same way that it's so difficult for me as a parent at times to make sure I'm being the parent I want to be and not the parent that I was raised by. It's the same thing happens with bosses, because we only know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. So that's really a big one. I think with customers, it's tough, especially in low-level jobs. And that got worse during the pandemic, I think, right? People started acting just nuts over retail workers and restaurant workers and whatever, as opposed to acting like, hey, these people probably aren't that excited to be here. Maybe I should do what I can to recognize that usually the problems that are occurring are not this person's fault in front of me. But people like having somebody to yell at and blame for problems, but that's not helpful. It's not productive.
Right.
There's a old colloquialism, you attract more flies with honey than with vinegar. Generally, you're not getting any benefit out of your life by being mean to people. Again, if people could I guess that goes back though to the exact same thing I said about the bosses, giving people the benefit of the doubt and not assuming they're trying to mess up or do things wrong. There are situations where work can be modified somewhat to help. Give people more autonomy in how they choose to do their work or when they work, but there aren't always times where that can happen, right? But there's certainly some jobs where that can be improved. Relationships, because they also say people make the place. Relationships with the boss and the coworkers and the clients is so critical that's often what I think affects a lot of it. I know of stories from my mother of getting, people being in screaming matches with her at the factory that she retired from last year. Whereas I think my dad was probably the one causing the interpersonal problems where he works. And what good does that do? He'd be a jerk to people and then go, well, I can't believe they gave me the minimum raise again this year. It's like, well, because nobody wants to work with a jerk. Like, it don't matter how good you are at welding or whatever, if you're a jerk. That's a bigger issue than just at work, because I think that's a lot of societal issues contributing to people being jerks to each other at times. And when we see people in positions of power modeling that behavior, and we see it all over social media, it then bleeds into real life and becomes part of how people act on a daily.
Almost sounds like people just need to be nicer in general.
Well, I think that wouldn't hurt anything, right? I don't think anybody can say that would be a bad thing for the world.
You mentioned the big 5 personality traits, and I've heard a lot of that in the workplace and having employees do those tests. Well, do you believe that big 5 does at predicting personality?
I'm a big believer that IO psychology has one of the most important theories to provide people for their daily lives. Campbell's model of job performance says the 3 direct determinants of performance are declarative knowledge, knowing what, procedural knowledge and skill, knowing how, practiced acts that develop over time, and motivation.
Okay.
And my postdoc advisor, Angela Duckworth, says motivation counts twice. You need to be motivated not only if you're going to apply knowledge. If motivation is 0, you're on the couch, your knowledge isn't doing anybody any good, but you need motivation to gain knowledge. If motivation is 0, you're never going to learn. Oh, I mean, I've learned a bunch of stuff from video games over the years, but that's not here or there. And that's a form of motivation that's intrinsic, but not necessarily useful use of time. I believe that model is applicable not only to job performance, but if you want to get healthy in life, whether it's losing weight or gaining muscle mass or just being more flexible and having less neck and back pain. It's also true, I think, of relationships. You want to be a better partner. Read up on how to do it. Start practicing that. And if you're not motivated to do it, boy, it's going to be a problem. So according to that model, personality can only indirectly influence job performance through its effects on either the acquisition of job-relevant knowledge and skills or through its effects on motivation. Things like conscientiousness definitely is related to motivation. One of the aspects of conscientiousness is achievement striving. The more that you desire to strive for achievement, it's kind of inherently, you're probably doing more stuff and being more active. So it can affect performance there. There are certain jobs where things like emotional stability or neuroticism is the other label it gives.
Okay.
At the other end of the pole. Super critical for things where you're in like emergency situations and high stakes situations where you need to keep your head about you while everybody else is losing theirs, such as emergency responders, police, fire department, military. Emotional stability becomes very, very important because you cannot have somebody literally like panicking in a situation where they're the one there because it's an emergency situation. Openness, where it's most relevant, it's a great paper by Timothy Judge and Mira Zapata back in 2015, I think, in Academy Management Journal. Openness best predicts performance in jobs that require innovation and creativity, because openness is this kind of desire and engagement with disparate sources of information, and that's the kind of crux and source of creativity, is pulling together disparate information. Now they're creating something new or some amalgamation that's different from what existed before. Agreeableness, useful in a customer service job, and particularly in like surviving a customer service job. But then you don't want to go too far to where now you're just letting customers like berate you and you're just like, okay, yeah, cool. Extroversion can be relevant, but introverts can be pretty good at acting extroverted. Extroverts can't be so good at acting introverted. You can still be an introvert and be successful in sales. Some of the best public speakers are introverts because they take more time to prepare and work harder at it. Really tough for an extrovert to sit down at a computer for 8 hours a day and work with nobody interacting with them.
Right.
So they do relate. 5, there's also the MBTI that a lot of people have probably heard of, the Myers-Briggs type indicator.
Yep.
No validity of it predicting things at work.
Wow, okay.
And that's what people get excited about more, because you can go, oh, what type are you? What type am I?
Right.
And you get to talk about your types, and so there might be some like face validity to it, but it's a bit more like a horoscope. So conscientiousness is the best predictor of outcomes across jobs in terms of personality traits, but it's dwarfed by measures of knowledge and skill.
How do you utilize AI to look at those job interviews and to look at kind of the verbal and nonverbal cues that people have?
We've now seen more studies than just mine come out as well that have done this well. In my study, we had success only in modeling interviewer judgments of the big 5 traits.
Okay.
We didn't have any success modeling self-reports. A couple of reasons. One, most people have an overly positive view of themselves, known as the Lake Wobegon effect, where all the kids are above average.
Yep.
And it's like if you ask people in a classroom of 150 people, how many of you think you're an above average driver? Something like 90% of hands go up, and you go, well, probably about
Clearly not.
40% of you are wrong, right? Because it just can't happen, and it's also referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. People just think that they're smarter and more skilled than they actually are relative to other people.
Yeah.
And then, so that really creates limitations on the quality of self-reports. And then self-reports, since they're not from that same context as the interview, and the interview is constrained to, hey, answer these in that study.
Right.
What the first sample was one question that had like several options in it. The second sample was 3 questions. The third sample was 5 questions. You're in a very constrained space, and when you have a stronger situation, personality has less ability to express itself.
Okay.
So you just didn't get the variability necessarily. But there was a recent paper that had people interact in an unstructured way with a chatbot, just with like typing out responses for 40 minutes, and they could model self-reports pretty well. In our case, we had a lot of success. We had people review the interview recordings, rate the big 5 traits of the people, and then we can model those interviewer-reported big 5 traits pretty well, especially for extroversion, conscientiousness, and openness. And in ways, openness is the only surprising one. Extroversion is the most visible and least evaluative of the big 5 traits.
Okay.
It's kind of like, you can see like the bubbly, excited person. versus like agreeableness in that interview. It's kind of tough to tell.
Yeah, how do you tell that?
They're meant to, right, you're kind of managing how agreeable you seem, even if you're disagreeable. Emotional stability, with few exceptions, isn't going to come out much in an interview. Likely you're not having a panic attack in the middle of the interview, although
it happens.
well, yes, and there's at least one participant I can recall that we discarded from the data set because instead of answering the interview questions, she was just like panicking and freaking out during the interview recording.
Makes sense.
So conscientiousness, kind of, do they seem like they're organized and doing good work and keeping themselves, completing the things they're supposed to complete in life? Extroversion, how talkative and energetic are they? Openness, a bit more surprising that worked as well as it did.
Wow.
But probably, seems to relate to, do they talk about kind of disparate things, or are they just talking about like sports and school and don't really talk about anything else? Do they seem to talk about broader subjects and ideas? Really worked pretty well. So in that, we use what they say, their verbal behaviors, how they say it, their paraverbal behaviors, your speech rate, pitch, intonation, and what they did, their nonverbal behaviors, which is a video interview, so we just focused on facial expressions.
Yep.
All of those to model the big 5 traits. People judge you as more extroverted if you talk faster, talk louder, you smile more. Actually, it wasn't smile more, excuse me. It was the standard deviation of how much you smile. So if you smile all the time like this, you come across like the Joker, and people are kind of creeped out. If you never smile, right, you look kind of grumpy. But if you appropriately modulate your smile in response to the situation, it seems to go a little bit better. And then conscientiousness, people were judged as more conscientious for using longer words.
Okay, interesting.
And I'd have to double check those specifics to remember the other ones, but that's the one I can remember off the top of my head. I just apparently indicated to people, a bit more, maybe emphasis on studying, reading, who knows. And then openness, recall all 3 models had the words or phrases including the words one and love. I don't really understand one.
Interesting.
But love I kind of get a little bit more, in terms of, I think, more open people have a more broader acceptance of what is acceptable in the world.
Right.
And how we should go about supporting people. Whereas if you're relatively closed off and not so open to experiences, I think it tends to be because you're not enjoying things as much and don't find as many things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
All of this AI for industrial psychology, I think one of the big questions I've heard people about AI is how do we keep bias out of there, or how do we keep, it to be ethical?
Yeah, and I still recall when I first told my wife's boss about this research I was doing, I goes, that sounds like Big Brother. He's probably never read 1984, but he still understands that concept and the kind of creepiness factor that people have about a computer judging them. So I'd say, one, in general now, the vendors are not using nonverbal and paraverbal cues for assessment anymore. They're just using what was said, which is what makes sense, because we know from IO-Psych literature that structured interviews are less biased and more fair and more valid at predicting job performance than unstructured interviews. And elements of interview structure include asking everybody the same question, having a scoring rubric that has behavioral anchors to describe effective responses. That way you reduce the subjectivity of the interviewer and you get a more standardized assessment that you can trust a little bit more. So that's all based, though, on what was said. It's not based on were they smiling, were they frowning. I remember once where I was interviewing for a job and the interviewer was clearly mad that I was like looking off in the distance to try to think up responses. He was clearly bothered by that, and like looking around to see what I was looking at. It's just, and then when you're around professors and graduate students, that's what everybody does.
Yeah, everyone just stares off things for a second.
So now they're almost all evaluating based on what is said. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. One, there are concerns that the facial recognition technology used to measure nonverbal behaviors is less accurate for people with darker skin tones.
Okay.
And the reason is twofold. One, they tend to be underrepresented in the training data, and when you train a statistical model, it learns the most prevalent patterns in the data.
Okay.
So if the prevalent patterns are primarily from like the lighter skinned people in the training data who dominate the training sample,
I see.
that's what you're going to see. But then two, physics.
Okay.
The darker your skin is, the less light bounces off of your skin, the harder it is for a camera to make out the contours of your face.
Okay.
And so it just doesn't have the resolution. Like I remember during the last Super Bowl, I think, Google was capitalizing, which I hate when companies do this, but capitalizing on Black History Month by advertising how some new phone of theirs does a better job of helping people with dark skin tones show up in pictures.
Wow.
Because like it's a problem even on like cell phone cameras. People don't, you're kind of like always underexposed or overexposed when your skin's darker on a lot of cameras. So in our research, when we've included nonverbal behaviors in models and examined how that impacts group differences and bias.
Okay.
Bias operationalized as the model is less accurate for one group compared to another group of people. If we include the nonverbal behaviors, we get larger group differences and larger group differences in accuracy or validity across groups.
Okay.
So it seems like those shouldn't be included, not only because they're not really relevant to your knowledge and skills, going back to Campbell's model of job performance, but they seem to cause more bias and unfairness as well.
Okay.
The paraverbal cues are also not really being used much anymore, although they do tend to have a bit more validity, particularly if you're trying to model human judgments of characteristics, because it seems to create a kind of halo effect. People like it when people talk faster. They don't want you talking too slow. If you're very monotone, right, that's going to cause issues. So having a little bit of energy and life in your voice tends to help in how other people judge you a little bit. So they're mostly focusing on what you say. You can still have bias and fairness issues when that occurs. Adjusting the outputs of models generally requires that you have information about the assessee's demography, and that's illegal to do. You cannot be adjusting scores in the United States based on the protected characteristics as classified by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1991, and later court decisions that have expanded those protections to include sexual orientation and things like that. So you cannot make those adjustments post hoc because it requires information about their demography, and that's illegal to do.
Illegal, right.
Now you could do it. You could do it based on, say you only want to hire people in the age of 35 to 39 and not people who are 20 to 25.
Okay.
That's legal in the United States.
Okay.
Age is only a protected class for 40 years and older. You're not protected against age discrimination when you're under the age of 40. But you shouldn't do that, right? So I'll say first, on pretty much all of these, we lack an understanding of, are they actually effective when you go beyond, when we're doing machine learning research, usually we're doing subsamples of a single set of participants, which tend to be homogeneous and collected at a single point in time.
Yeah.
We don't know much about the effectiveness of these approaches when we take them to an entirely new sample of data collected in the future. Because what they'll do, for example, is what's called dual objective optimization or bi-objective optimization. One, you're training your model then to where one of the objective functions is maximize prediction, which is already what your model's trying to do.
Okay.
But two, minimize the amount of information about demography in the predictions. So that's just going to adjust the weights in the model to try to minimize those group differences. But then when you deploy the model, it does not need information about demography. So it's legal to use, but it's not clear that it really, unless you have huge samples and on similar populations to what you were training the model on, that it's really effective in the future. It's just not clear yet. We've looked at also just adjust your training data. What happens if you say in your training data there's group differences in the outcome variable that you're trying to model?
Right.
Well, that seems concerning to me at times if you're saying, well, we have rules around group differences and selection ratios, and you're going to say, oh, there's a big group difference in the selection ratio, let's go ahead and train our model on it.
Yeah.
That seems, since they say that models will tend to perpetuate or even exacerbate group differences, that seems concerning. So we investigated what happens if we oversample minority applicants who then had high scores in this data set to then make it to where the training data group means are equal.
Okay.
And it doesn't completely remove the group differences in the predictions, and it probably shouldn't.
Right.
But it does reduce them.
Okay.
So adjusting your training data to have a more equitable representation of the groups in the training data does seem to enhance fairness. Schools are funded in the United States based on property taxes. That means if you grow up in an impoverished area, you have a worse school. Doesn't seem fair then to test people based on the quality of schooling that you got as opposed to something else. But there will always be group differences in knowledge and skills. Similarly, if you think about upper body strength, say you have a job that requires that you can consistently lift 40 to 50 pounds above your head.
Okay.
Well, men are going to tend to score higher in that test and pass it at a higher rate than women will.
Right.
That doesn't mean that that test is biased against women. It means there are biological differences and kind of preparational differences in men and women that then change their upper body strength. Women can tend to pass those tests if they go and prepare a little bit, right? Spend a few months training, but they're just less likely to be able to without any additional training and effort. So it's not to say that every test is unbiased. That's certainly not the case, but it's to say that group differences don't mean bias, and that's one of the fundamental differences between the lay perceptions and the IO psychologists.
I see.
Of people thinking if there's group differences, it's biased, whereas we say no, bias is these very specific mathematical things that are not necessarily group differences. But whenever you have group differences, you should scrutinize and measure more for indications of bias.
Okay. What, from your knowledge of industrial psychology, would you say are like the best pieces of information that you've gained for them to know?
Well, it's not something I gained from IO psychology, but use ChatGPT.
Use ChatGPT.
Yeah, use it. I talk to people who, particularly people that have trouble with the written word, or maybe English isn't their native language.
Yeah.
They use it to write emails, and they write now the most beautiful emails that anybody's ever seen type of thing, where it really comes out that it just makes a huge difference for them. I use it for work and helping my writing, helping write code.
Yeah.
Because it's useful. You can use it to help apply for jobs, write cover letters, all these different things. Go ahead. Use it to your advantage as much as possible. Though that nothing in life that's worth doing is easy to do. Right. Which is not a fun thing to tell people. They don't like hearing that. But if Campbell's model of job performance is right, then what it requires to be successful in something or to get to do something maybe different than what you're doing, or you want to do what you're doing better, you have to gain the knowledge and skill. And that takes effort and time and patience. And I remember in grad school some really hard times when I'm trying to learn how to code and had no idea how to do it, and was stressed up to here because I was working full-time and going to grad school. But kind of eventually, suddenly I was over that hump, and now it's something that I have as an advantage and that I get paid to teach courses on and things. But it requires, some people say it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. Yeah. Of working deliberately and hard at it. That's 5 years of full-time work.
It's a PhD.
It's 5 years of full-time work to become this very knowledgeable, skilled person at something. And if you can find that thing that you're interested in that would do that, that's really useful. The other thing that, again, probably less IO psychology and more just school of hard knocks type of thing, is when you want to question the way that things are done, or you want to provide a suggestion, or you have a question that's kind of out there, you have to be very tactful about how you go about doing that. Right. Because of people back to our earlier part of the conversation, because of people not giving you the benefit of the doubt. Yeah. And thinking that somehow you're doing something wrong, or being a jerk, or being selfish, or whatever. That's going to be their assumption if you don't come at it in a very tactful, respectful way.
Basically, use ChatGPT and realize that in order to gain those skills, it will take many hours of hard work and finding something that you're motivated about to perpetuate you to learn and grow in that field to work more at it.
Yep, motivation counts twice. You need the motivation to learn. You can get that motivation by being intrinsically interested in something, and you can maintain the motivation by taking care of yourself. Yeah. And being compassionate with yourself. How to get people to want to tune in and turn on, as opposed to like tuning out and zoning out.
Yeah.
How to encourage people to have a passion in something they're interested in. I was in Amsterdam in October and got to go to the Van Gogh Museum. I did all of this painting and made himself one of the renowned painters in a period of like 10 years because he just worked obsessively at it and was doing it all the time. How can you help people find something that they find pleasure and joy in doing and want to do it and show up and do it and keep working at it?
Become obsessed.
Right, and because without that, you find yourself, as I have at times in my life, in jobs that you don't care about and jobs that you don't want to be doing. But if you can find something you're passionate about, and not everybody needs to get a PhD, not everybody needs to get a college degree.
Right.
Things like electrical work I find super satisfying. You're just like solving problems, like putting a puzzle together. There are so many things that people can do and be passionate about and interested in, but it's a matter of how to, particularly when there are not immediate rewards for it.
Right.
How to get people interested in that and willing to do that and keep putting in effort every day when you're not seeing a return on your investment because it's potentially very far away or will never happen. Like Van Gogh, his life didn't go that well, but he was still obsessively working at painting and created something now that people still are affected by 100 years later.
Right.
What an amazing thing because of this passion that he had. So how to get people that exposure to that. Maybe videos like this help people find some of these passions so that they can hear about things they wouldn't know about otherwise. But how do you do that and support people so that they can and want to do that? So I guess this goes back to very early in the conversation about this requires really societal type changes as opposed to small changes, like supporting and fostering this curiosity and for people and help them figure out what they enjoy doing regardless of their natural level of capabilities so they can do something special, unique, and provide that to the world and say, oh, that's me, here it is.
There you go. Well, regardless of that, I appreciate that you've been motivated to go through all this and learn and grow and develop, and I would love to thank you for this time. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yes!